Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, interesting timing today. I had been thinking about for a while now. I'm a big fan of the channel. Doughty, who is a mortician who does a lot of videos about like death and sometimes the history of death and the history of specific bodies and exhumations, and does a lot of stuff about how like embalming happens. And it's just, many of you are probably familiar with her channel, and she's got a little bit of kind of a dark tint to how she does it, and that's fine. I think it works. And like I said, I'm a big fan of the channel, and I've watched quite a few of her videos, but I haven't watched this one yet. And I'd been thinking about doing a reaction to a couple of her videos for a while now to do with history. But then I saw the news this morning, unfortunately, about the shooting that happened at the Catholic school in church in Minneapolis. And I thought this was probably a good time to cover this one instead. This is a video she has called "Why Do We Get Columbine So Wrong?" Now, if you're not familiar with my channel or you don't know my background, I need to acknowledge this up front, that I have some very dear friends whose daughter was the very first person killed in the Columbine shooting. So no doubt we're going to talk about Rachel Scott. The Scott family are some of the most wonderful, warm, loving, kind human beings I have ever known in my life. They are family to me. Rachel's dad is like a father to me. He really is. And her brothers and sisters, Bethany, Dana, Mike, and Craig, are some of the most wonderful people I've ever met. Her stepmom, Sandy, is the sweetest person on the planet. And so I very much view Rachel Scott like the little sister I never got to meet. And I've worked for Rachel's Challenge for a decade now, sharing Rachel's story and sharing the story of the other victims of Columbine. So I'm intimately familiar with this story. So I'm very curious to see how she goes about sharing it and portraying it. And it'll be a good chance for us to talk about this a little bit and talk about just in general school shootings. They're complicated, and I understand that these are really sensitive matters, especially for those of us who have kids. Today is my boys' first day of school. I was out taking pictures of them this morning, and I can't even begin to wrap my mind around what I would feel if I found out that this happened at my kid's school. I'm sure it would change my life forever, as it has all too many people, unfortunately. So I'm going to put the link in the description. That way you can check out Caitlin's channel and all of her commentary. Let's dive into this one.
School shootings have become as American as baseball and apple pie. They're part of our national identity. On our passports with this eagle and this waving wheat, there should also be a white teenager with a gun. Most of us...
So a couple of things about this. I'm not going to deny any of what she just said, but some context. The worst act of school violence in American history happened about 100 years ago in Bath, Michigan. Did not involve a gun, involved a couple of bombs that were made, and that's a story in and of itself that could be shared. At the time Columbine happened, on April 20th, 1999, it was the worst school shooting in American history. Sadly, is no longer the case. But also the top 10 most deadly acts of school violence, none of them happened in the United States. That's not to in any way discount what she's saying. They happen much more frequently in the United States than they happen anywhere else. And we do have very different gun laws than most countries on earth. So
couldn't accurately say how many victims there have been in the last 5 years, or how many mass shootings at schools or churches or movie theaters. We lost count a while ago. But this weariness, this burnout of our empathy wasn't yet the case on April 20th, 1999 at Columbine.
That's actually a really good point. And it's difficult for the generation that did not live through Columbine to understand what this event was like when it happened. When I graduated from high school in 1995, I think the worst school shooting that had happened in my lifetime involved like 4 people, like killed 4 people. Columbine took that from 4 to, and I may be forgetting 1 or 2 here and there, but like when we had school shootings, they usually involved a handful of people, and they were awful and they were tragic. But when Columbine happened, and there were 13 that were murdered that day by those two gunmen, and I believe now they've since upped the death toll to 14 because Anne Marie Hochhalter just died in the last year of complications from her wounds suffered all the way back in 1999. But you have to understand, this was a moment that brought our country to a halt. I mean, this was shocking. This was like 9/11 feelings is what we had when this happened. It was that big a deal. It really, really was.
Columbine High School, the day you could call the first mass shooting of the digital age.
Yeah.
I was a freshman in high school at the time, and a bit of a goth myself, so yes, I paid attention. And with the wall-to-wall media coverage lasting weeks, to this day,
So I want to point out a couple things about just the stuff you just saw, because a lot of things, they go by so fast, you might miss it. There were 13 murders that took place, in addition to the two gunmen who took their own lives. 2 were outside, Rachel Scott, Danny Rohrbaugh. The rest were inside, most of them in the library. And you can actually, in the various news footages, see the bodies of the 2 that were killed outside.
Paid attention.
That's Danny Rohrbaugh right there. He was the second one to be killed. This right here, this is the cafeteria. A lot of people don't know that this was supposed to be a school bombing. The 2 killers had put duffel bags rigged with propane tanks that had timed explosives on them. And they put them in the cafeteria, and they had planned this for about a year. And they put the bombs in the cafeteria set to go off, I think, at 11:17, if I remember right, because they figured out that was the moment when the most people would be in the cafeteria. And there were 2 kind of pillars that held up the library, which was on the 2nd floor above the cafeteria. And I think their goal was to blow up those pillars, collapse the library down on the 500 or so students that were in the cafeteria, and then shoot the survivors as they ran out, like right here, of the cafeteria into where the senior parking lot was. So Danny was killed there, and right up the stairs is where Rachel was killed.
And with the wall-to-wall media coverage lasting weeks, to this day,
In fact, that's actually Rachel Scott's body right there. That's not where she was killed. She was killed right by the entrance on the 2nd floor there. This fire truck, they pulled the fire truck up, and they got Richard Castaldo, who was with Rachel and survived, and they dragged both of them out of there, and they dragged Rachel's body away, but she was already dead by that point, unfortunately.
Still retains so much about the events of that day. 2 teenagers, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, were mercilessly teased and bullied in high school. Teased for liking Marilyn Manson and wearing black trench coats. They were rejected by the jocks. They were rejected by girls.
There's some truth to that. It's not as simple as that. Was there bullying that went on? Yes. But Eric especially was a bully himself. Understand that one of the people that Eric Harris murdered was Kyle Velasquez, who was a student with special needs who had just started going to Columbine because he had been bullied so badly at his previous school. So I don't want to say it didn't happen, but I also don't want to give them the convenient excuse to say, well, they were bullied and so they were getting revenge. It's a lot more complicated than that. Eric, I'm not a psychologist, but I think it's fair to say he was what you would call a psychopath. Dylan was more of a follower who I think just found in Eric someone that understood him, and he kind of went along for the ride. Most of the murders were done by Eric. Even several of the people that Dylan shot, Eric shot too.
They took out their anger in violent video games, which led to a real-life plan to get as many guns as they could and shoot as many fellow students as they could.
Again, it was a bombing, and then they were going to shoot the survivors. The bombs didn't go off, and so they started shooting their way into the school.
That narrative of Columbine has become the origin story, the genesis of this modern-day religion of angry, disenfranchised men. But as it turns out, little of that story is true.
Okay, good. I'm glad she's pointing that out. All right, now I feel a little better about this.
In fact, the only part of what I said that was strictly true is there is solid evidence the 2 young men did sometimes listen to Marilyn Manson, even though he wasn't their favorite. There is so much about Columbine that I, and maybe you, had completely wrong, which, given how much influence Columbine has had in the last 20 years, is downright dangerous. Peter Langman is a psychologist who has been tracking and documenting school shootings for years. He's found that Columbine has influenced more than 30 violent attacks and shootings. When you chart it, Columbine's influence splits off and mutates in all directions.
And it's also true that not only has Columbine influenced some of these other school shootings, but it's also, for a long time, it was the standard by which we judged other school shootings. In fact, when Parkland happened, and I get a little emotional just thinking about this because, my God, again, as a dad, I can't begin to imagine what these families have gone through, and I know some of these families, and so, I've gotten to know the mom of one of the kids from Sandy Hook as well, and when Parkland happened, the first text message I sent about it said, "My God, it's worse than Columbine." It became our standard for this stuff.
An evil spider, the Virginia Tech shooter, the Santa Fe shooter, the shooter at Sandy Hook Elementary who killed 21st graders used to post on forums about Columbine High School and filled his Tumblr with photos of the Columbine victims and played
And the Columbine shooters themselves were inspired by people like Adolf Hitler. It's why they chose Adolf Hitler's birthday to do this, April 20th. So there's always a connection to people that find their inspiration in others.
First-person shooter game called Super Columbine Massacre RPG. Here's this story about Columbine that has so much cultural power and has caused so much destruction, and it's not even correct. Let's start in a maybe silly but still important place. Everyone knows the two shooters were in the trench coat mafia. They wore trench coats, makeup, berets, their tastes were dark, borderline gothic, they were into witchcraft, there were rumors they were gay, and this outsider fashion and sexuality is part of why they were so bullied. Now, it's not that the truth here is more complicated, it's just wrong. There was a group at Columbine High School calling themselves the Trenchcoat Mafia, but the two shooters were not a part of it.
Right.
But if you search major newspapers from the day following the shooting, the New York Times, the BBC, they all clearly identify and link the shooters as being part of the Trenchcoat Mafia, this group of trenchcoat-wearing loners. But
now, you see that image there. I think that's probably from the video that they made. They made a video a while before the shooting happened. Where it was for a class and it's complicated, but that's not actual video from the shooting itself that you see there.
The students the papers interviewed, and even the students the police interviewed, were constantly confusing the shooters for other different students at Columbine.
Right, and part of the complication there is because of that video that you see of them wearing black coats like that, and I think they may have been wearing them that day as well. I know Eric took his off, but
it's not that there weren't kids like this at Columbine High School, students in the Trenchcoat Mafia. They were just not Dylan and Eric. The story quickly became that because they were these outsiders, Dylan and Eric went in looking to kill the jocks that taunted and bullied them, and the shallow girls that were...
Now, there is some truth to that. In fact, so a lot of athletes at Columbine wore white hats, often backwards on their heads. And you can clearly hear, there was a teacher who made a 911 call from the library, which is where most of the shooting took place. And she was on the phone when the shooters came into the library. And you can clearly hear one of them yell, "Everybody with a white hat, stand up," because they were all hiding under the tables. And Rachel Scott's brother, Craig, who's a friend of mine, and we'll talk more about him later when we get to Cassie Bernall, was wearing a white hat, and he took his off and he tucked it under his shirt, and he was actually under a table. He was a wrestler, and he was under a table with two other athletes who were both killed that day.
Rejected them. Adding to that, they were probably white supremacists, so they were going to kill minorities as well. But in fact,
There, I think, is some truth, especially with Eric, about the white supremacy thing.
Had no targets. Yes, before killing people, they taunted and attacked their victims for what made them different, but it was seemingly entirely at random.
On one hand, that's true. Did they go in with like a hit list? No. They did target who they went after, but they did make a video where they talked about the fact they were going to do this, and they did specifically mention at least one of the people they end up shooting, which was Rachel Scott. They talked about that Christian Bitch Rachel. Now, I think that was probably more Eric, because I think Dylan and Rachel maybe weren't, like, I think Dylan liked Rachel, but and Eric was the one that killed her, but I don't want to dig too much into speculation about stuff.
Quite a few of the victims had never even met their killers.
That's true. It was a huge school. I mean, we're talking like 2,000 students in this high school, so that's absolutely true.
Turns out the teenagers, especially Eric, were great with the ladies, good at school, liked sports, had friends in diverse racial groups, and perhaps most importantly, had a solid group of friends.
Eric was a military kid. His dad was an officer in the Air Force.
It seems like I'm trying to make these two people look better. I'm not.
Right.
They're mass murderers, so we're clear. But they became the poster boys for goth, loner, unlucky with the ladies,
right.
racist revenge.
Right.
And the evidence shows that was inaccurate.
Again, I would say, though, that the obsession with Hitler and a lot of stuff that they said that day would definitely put them in the racist category.
Future school shooters saw themselves here, deeply, personally, where they shouldn't have. In fact, there's evidence that Dylan and Eric were much bigger bullies than they were victims of bullying.
100% agree with that.
They frequently picked on people in an attempt to start fights,
yep.
and even singled out certain students for long-term harassment, some of which was reported to school administration. But perhaps the biggest myth was that this was a mass shooting. Obviously, it was. I'm not doing some Alex Jones weirdness.
Right.
But Columbine wasn't intended to be a shooting at all. It was intended to be a bombing.
Yep.
The two killers planted bombs outside the school to distract law enforcement.
Yeah, there was one in a field about 3 miles away, and that one actually did explode. But the two, thankfully, that they put in the cafeteria did not.
And bombs in their cars to blow up TV news trucks and rescue workers.
Yep.
The main...
Probably inspired by Bath, Michigan, because that's exactly what happened there. The guy there blew up the school. He had another bomb in the school that didn't go off. And then he drove up with a in his truck that he exploded after first responders had arrived.
The focus of their attack were propane bombs in the cafeteria,
yep.
which were supposed to kill hundreds of people. Again, showing the attack was about pure violence. And
in fact, you can see there's a surveillance video of them in the cafeteria, and I think they're trying to shoot the propane tanks to make them explode since they didn't go off.
Numbers of the dead, not targeting anyone specific. Because they were teenagers and bad bomb makers, all of their bigger bombs failed, foiling their plan. The guns they amassed, the ones they ended up using, were just there as backup to shoot those who were fleeing the bombing.
Yep.
This mass shooting, which has inspired dozens of copycats, was actually a failed bombing. This is important because for a certain type of young man, the guns and shooting themselves were glamorized.
Right.
And in America, guns are a hell of a lot easier to get than bombs.
Now, understand that the guns they got were acquired illegally, and the person who helped them get the guns did a couple years in prison.
Even the reporting on the actual deaths was rife with inaccuracy.
Yeah.
Cassie Bernall was 17 years old and one of the 13 people killed that day at Columbine. It's tricky to talk about her because Cassie herself did absolutely nothing wrong.
Amen.
She played no part in the somewhat bizarre mythologizing of her death. The original account of Cassie's death was that in the moments before she was killed, she was asked, "Do you believe in God?" by one of the shooters. The implied question here was, do you still believe in God in the face of this murder, this violence? Cassie said yes, and then was killed.
It was Valiant
This
Schnur.
account of her saying yes launched evangelical rallies, Christian rock songs, even a book written by Cassie's mother called
Yep.
She Said Yes.
And it's a great book. And here's the thing. And I'm sure she's going to talk about this a little more. I don't want to step on too much of it here. The fact is, this conversation did happen in the library. I know the person who heard it. He got the person wrong. it was a girl named Valine Schnurr, sometimes called Val. Craig Scott, Rachel's brother, was the one who heard this. And he actually went back into the library, and I give Craig all the credit in the world for this. He's an incredible guy, one of my favorite people to hang out with. He went back in the library with law enforcement while they were still cleaning up and while there was blood everywhere. And remember, he had been in there and seen people murdered as a teenager. He was a 16-year-old kid at the time. And he told them about hearing this conversation. And when he pointed to where he heard it, Cassie was in the other direction. Well, by this time, the story had already taken off, and it was kind of like the genie had been let out of the bottle and they couldn't rein it back in. So they knew within a couple of days of the shooting that it wasn't Cassie who said this. And on top of that, then there is also the story that Rachel was asked this question. And our source for that is the only person who is alive who was present when Rachel was killed, and that is Richard Castaldo, who was next to her. And he said that he heard Eric ask her, "Do you still believe in God?" Or "Where is your God now? Do you still believe in him?" And she said, "You know that I do." And he said, "Well, go be with him," and shot her in the temple after she had already been shot several times at that point from a distance, but wasn't dead yet. Now, what happened was Richard ended up unconscious for a while after he had initially shared that story. And then when he woke back up, he couldn't remember what happened. And so when they followed up with him about that, he couldn't say for sure if that's what happened. But as time went on, his memory started coming back, and he did confirm again to Rachel's family, yes, this is what happened. In fact, if you look it up today, you'll find news stories with later interviews with him where he went on to say they also asked him that question, and he said no, and they left him alone, even though he'd already been shot, and he's in a wheelchair. He's paralyzed from the waist down. And that he said in this interview that he always regretted he didn't have the balls to say yes like Rachel did. Now, again, none of this takes away from any of the story or adds to it, and I'm not trying to make a martyr out of either one of them. Cassie's story is actually really remarkable without that she said yes part, and the book's still worth reading. Did she get asked that question? No. It sounds like she was shot before she had any interaction with the men, these young men, unfortunately. But she still has a remarkable story because she had a very difficult life and made some really poor choices, and her Christian faith helped turn her life around. And that we know is true, regardless of who was asked what in the last moments of their lives.
Cassie had become a full-fledged martyr for refusing to deny God.
Right.
In the face of this horrible tragedy for the evangelical and Christian communities, here was this inspiring girl. The story started because that day a student had overheard a girl say she still believed in God before being shot. It just wasn't Cassie Bernall. It was another student named Val Schnurr. Val survived, badly wounded, 4 bullets still lodged in her abdomen. By the time the investigators realized they had the wrong martyr, so to speak, Cassie had already become famous.
Yep.
Investigators told Cassie's parents that unfortunately the story was not true. Cassie didn't say yes, and many eyewitnesses corroborated that. But they didn't publicly expose the truth.
Yeah, my understanding is that whichever one of the boys that shot her banged on the top of the table because they were all hiding under the tables and said peekaboo and shot real fast. In fact, I think it was when Eric shot, I think it was probably Eric, when he shot Cassie was when he broke his nose because he held the shotgun up to his face like this and the kick like hit him in the face or something.
They felt it had gone too far, that too many Christians were already devoted to the legend. As the Bernalls' pastor told the Washington Post, "You will never change the story of Cassie. The church is going to stick to the martyr story. It's the story they heard first and circulated for 6 months uncontested. To the church, Cassie will always say yes. Period."
And here's the fact. She said yes with her life every day. That's, to me, the important thing. But it is important to speak the truth.
I feel like that quote could apply to the whole of the Columbine myth. You will never change the story. It's the story they heard first, period.
Right.
So this brings us to the real question. Why is it even important to get Columbine right anymore? It happened 20 years ago. Well, first of all, Columbine is not less relevant or less dangerous than it was 20 years ago.
Right.
The shooters wanted to exploit the 24-hour cable news cycle, just like the mass shooters of the last 5 years want to grab the news and internet through manifestos and videos and live streaming. And that desire to capture and exploit our fear and imaginations through media always seems to work exactly as they planned. Dave Cullen, whose book Columbine is considered the definitive text on the murders.
And I will tell you this, Dave Cullen's book is not highly regarded by the people who went through this. The families who lived through this tragedy, the victims' families, and I've heard this from several of them, do not think highly of this book. So I don't recommend Dave Cullen's book. I've heard nothing but negative things from people in Littleton in that community about that book.
Is against publicly naming mass shooters and sharing glorified photos of them. Sure, the truly curious can find out every grotesque detail they're interested in online, but by keeping their names and images out of mass media, it denies the killers the notoriety they seek.
Let me tell you one thing about Columbine that people don't realize. Because this was such a massive news story, and it was for a long time. I mean, you can't really compare, unfortunately, some of the ones that have come since that have even been worse because we now have a culture where this is the norm. But that was such a shocking event at the time, and it became such a part of the news cycle that these families' lives have never been the same. I was talking to, I don't want to give details because I don't have permission to do that. I was talking to a close relative of Rachel's about this, who told me that for months after the shooting, they couldn't walk out the door of their house without somebody from the media there waiting to talk to them. They couldn't go to her gravesite for months afterwards without being stalked by somebody from the media. I mean, it's bad enough to go through the tragedy of losing a child, a niece, a nephew, a brother, sister, but then to constantly have it be in your face like that because somebody wants to put your face on a TV screen.
You don't murder dozens of people at random without seeking notoriety. Cullen says that for killers, there are two routes to the elite club where the media rolls out the red carpet and gives you the star treatment. Body count or creativity. If you choose body count, you better break the top 10 because the media loves keeping score in the chyron beneath your high school yearbook photo. And if you choose creativity, you have to shock us by killing little kids or the Amish. These amount to spectacle killings, performance.
See, I think he's overanalyzing it. I don't think that, for example, the Amish shooter at the school in Pennsylvania was thinking, I need to kill Amish people because it's creative and it'll get my name in the paper. No, those were the people he knew. That was the familiarity. Those were the people that were accessible to him. Adam Lanza with Sandy Hook, same deal. I don't think we're trying to ascribe rational thinking to people who are clearly irrational.
Violence. Adding to that, Columbine is still being used as inspiration and as a source of contagion. Just like high-profile suicides have been proven contagious, shootings are also contagious. That's why it's so important that the media gets things right. One study at Arizona State found that mass shootings can infect new shooters, like a disease. There is, quote, significant evidence that mass killings involving firearms are incented, meaning incentivized, by similar events in the immediate past.
And that's true with anything in history. Talk to people at schools where there have been more than one suicide or suicide attempt at a school. When a student takes their own life at a school, there's a significantly heightened risk of more students attempting or successfully taking their own lives at that school. There is a copycat syndrome that happens with this stuff.
And no one talks about the danger of this contagion more than an unlikely source, Sue Klebold, Dylan Klebold's mother. She told the New York Times, "We don't do this intentionally, but we glorify shooters by showing the damage they've done."
I want to give Sue Klebold a lot of credit, and I've heard positive things said about her by the Scott family, for example. I'll never forget talking to Rachel Scott's dad about this, and he said, people have said to me, I can't imagine anything worse than losing a child the way that you did. And he says, I can. Losing a child the way she did. Because they both lost children that day. His daughter was murdered, but her son died as well after committing mass murder. Imagine going through that. And I give her a lot of credit. She did a TED Talk. She's written a book, all with the goal of saying, listen, my son did this, and I never saw it coming. And she tries to speak out and talk about what they missed and how a lot of people had little pieces of the puzzle. And if they'd have just gotten together and they've spoken together, they might have figured out that this kid was hurting and this kid was angry and that he was thinking about doing this, and this got planned for a year right under their noses. Now, Eric's father, different story. I just want to say this as a dad. If someone told me that my kid had done something like this, I'd be in denial, and I would never want to believe it was true. One of the first 911 calls that came in when the news broke about Columbine was from Eric's dad. And he said, I just saw that there is something going on at Columbine, and I'm afraid my son might be involved. Who says that except someone who already had a sense that there was something troubling going on with their child, who was building bombs in the basement of their house? So I give her credit for speaking out about a very, very painful topic and hopefully trying to help somebody.
All the crying, all the empty seats, and for people with rage, that has a particular appeal for them. Klebold realizes that angry young men are using every part of Columbine as a blueprint. There are Tumblr communities devoted to them. She still gets letters from young women in love with Dylan. Because of this, she has specifically fought against the release of videotapes that the two teenagers filmed in her basement,
They're called the Columbine tapes or the basement tapes.
About why and how they would commit the killings.
Yeah.
In fact, Sue Klebold is the reason I became so interested in the truth behind Columbine.
And I believe they did make those accessible to the victims' families who heard them and saw them and were able to hear what was said.
I met her when we were both speakers at the TED Med conference. As soon as she found out I was a funeral director, all she wanted to talk with me about was brain donation. Which brings us to our final misunderstanding about Columbine. Yes, there were two killers at Columbine, but they weren't equal criminal masterminds.
You know what? When I saw the pictures of the two, especially the angry pictures of them from screenshots from videos, I always assumed that Dylan was the leader and Eric was the follower. It's actually quite the opposite. As I said at the beginning, Eric, psychopath. Dylan, depressed, hurting kid who went along for the ride.
It's generally understood by the psychiatrists and investigators that have looked most deeply at the murders that Dylan Klebold, Sue's son, was severely depressed, hated himself, and was suicidal.
Yeah.
Eric Harris was callous, self-obsessed, full of sadistic fantasies, and believed to be a psychopath.
Yep.
Eric wanted to kill others, and Dylan wanted to kill himself. That takes no blame off of Dylan for helping plan a massacre.
But it's important to point that out. We can speak and understand the reasons without removing blame, right? They're responsible for what they did, 100%. But it's important to understand it because understanding why they did it maybe helps us prevent the next one.
But it might have made him more susceptible to someone like Eric. Today, Sue Klebold works with suicide prevention and is interested in funeral homes being aware of brain donation because she wants more direct research done on mental health and depression. She lives every day wishing she had known what to look for in Dylan's actions. History that is wrong always should be corrected, but history that is so relevant and still causes so much pain 20 years later requires to be corrected sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
If you're interested in more details, Columbine by Dave Cullen and A Mother's Reckoning by Sue Klebold are a good place to start.
that was really well done. She did a great job with a very difficult topic, and I think she got her stuff right with it, which is good. I can't recommend Dave Cullen's book just because the people I know who directly were involved in this won't recommend it. And if the people who know better than anyone what this experience was like won't recommend it, then I won't either. Sue Klebold's book, Different Story, I highly recommend that, especially if you're a parent, especially if you're involved in the mental health field. Really important stuff. So all I can say in closing is love your kids, hold them tight, pray. I don't pretend to have any easy answers. There's obviously definitely a legal aspect to all of this in terms of gun control and access that needs to be discussed when these things happen. But for me personally, I'm much more concerned with the other end of things, which is the mental health aspect and that sort of thing. And I honestly, truly do believe that reaching out and connecting with people, especially the ones that we see as loners, can to a degree help prevent this kind of stuff from happening. So if you're an outgoing person, go out of your way to reach out to and connect to the people who don't speak much and don't interact with others, and maybe make a friend of the friendless and maybe help prevent something like this. Thanks for watching.